Okay. Good evening. Or not evening. It's not evening at all. Good morning. It'll eventually be good evening, and then that'll be relevant. But until then, good morning. Thank y'all for coming this morning and for joining us again. I know we're a little bit behind because we weren't able to meet last Sunday due to weather. So what I will attempt to do is we will cover what we would have covered last week, and then also pick up where we needed to be this week. Hopefully, that'll get us back on track and able to finish the rest of 2 Samuel through this quarter. So before we get started, if you will please bow with me in a word of prayer. Dear God, we are thankful for you allowing us to be able to wake up this morning, to be able to come here and to gather with one another, to sing songs of praise, and to also to refocus our hearts and our minds and continue to learn more about your word, to remain sharp in the things that you're in your teachings, and to better refine ourselves to the Christians you'd have us to be. We pray that we're able to block out the worldly distractions and to focus on the readings of your word. We also pray that we can continue to be truthful and honest with ourselves, to be able to find those faults that we know that we have, to continue to acknowledge those and to seek to rectify those through your direction. We ask you to be with those in the congregation who may be sick, who may be struggling. Pray that they look towards you for guidance and strength, and also that we make ourselves available to them to be an encouragement, so they may seek you, and also that if it be your will, that they may be brought back to a portion of their health to be with us at the next appointed time. We ask this on your Son, Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So where we last left off was right at the tail end of chapter 17. And so just kind of a quick summary of where we were before is Adam covered for us beginning at chapter 15, which is right when Absalom was permitted back into the kingdom by David after being kind of exiled after killing his brother, Amnon, if I'm remembering correctly. And so when he was brought back in, he then kind of begins to seek his own repositioning and try to usurp David's authority by placing himself in the grace of the people, and then eventually breaking away the majority of Israel, with then David having to flee across the Jordan. And so that's where we will pick up today. In 2 Samuel 17, verses 27 is where we will start. And if I do this properly, we will end right at the tail end of 19. So beginning in chapter 17, verse 27, and we'll kind of be bouncing back and forth to make sure that we're all tied up from where we left off with the gap that we had. So in 27, we see that David and his men have crossed over the Jordan and are fleeing from Absalom, and they've come to Menahem, where they were met by Shobi, Machir, and Barzillai. And David and his men were received with a warm welcome and were provided beds, food, and water by the men. And this is very important because kind of how quickly David had to leave after receiving word from Ahimaaz and Jonathan of Absalom's plan, that they packed it very quickly and took off that direction. And so they weren't necessarily sure that they would receive a warm welcome, and they did by these three individuals. And while they were in Menahem, David took account of the number of men with him and assigned captains over the group. So you can see that he is now transitioning from an individual fleeing to now seeking to reclaim or to go to battle to reclaim his throne. And so we see that he is set, so we can kind of get an understanding of how big David's army is at this point. And so he sets his captains of his thousands and captains of hundreds over them. So all he left, so if we recall, how many people did he originally flee with? You can find this in 2 Samuel 15, verse 18. And if you flip there really quickly, you'll see it's about 600 men. And so now that 600 has turned into thousands. So you can see as David was, although fleeing from Absalom's kind of usurp of his authority, he was able to pick up eventually individuals rallying to his aid as he made his way across the Jordan into safety. And so David divided his troops into thirds. He placed over those thirds Joab, Abishai, and Attai in charge of each group. And David intended to also join the battle, as was customary with the kings when they went to war at this point in time, which is different than what he did when he ended up in the situation with Bathsheba. When the men went to war then, this time, David intended to join them. However, he was counseled not to by his men. And David kind of pushed back initially, but then eventually agreed. And as the men were leaving his command, or as the men were leaving to go confront Absalom's army, he commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai to deal gently with the young man Absalom for David's sake. So we kind of see again that although if a king had been dealing with someone who was seeking to take over his throne and his kingdom, what normally would have been the appropriate course of action for the individual that was seeking claim to your throne? Death. Fairly straightforward. But in this instance, again, we see kind of David's lack of desire to address the issue correctly. And so he's directed his thousands of men to go to war, but then when they meet the main individual seeking to usurp his throne, he asks for them to deal gently with him. Again, showing David's inability to address the broader situation appropriately. So in chapter 18, verses 6, we see that David's army went into battle in the woods of Ephraim, where David's army defeated, and the verse actually says, slaughtered 20,000 of Absalom's men. Importantly, though, noting that the woods devoured more people that day than the sword. So kind of taking into that into reference in what we know between David and God, what factors can we kind of discern played a part in the defeat of Absalom's army? God. Absolutely. Anything specific? Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, the woods played a part more than the sword, absolutely. And if you take into account the 20,000, we don't necessarily know, no, the assumption is that he brought 20,000 to then. We don't necessarily know the full count of David's army, but it's noted that when Hushai's direction to Absalom when they were going to war was that they needed to collect all the individuals from the rest of Israel to then go and attack David. So the assumption potentially would be that David's men, although he had thousands gathered, was still outnumbered, but that through God's assistance, he was able to defeat Absalom's army. So specifically, 2 Samuel 7 is God's covenant to David, saying that his throne will continue to reign and his seed will continue to be there. Now, you could the question to this part from David's perspective is, yes, God made that covenant with me, that my throne will reign and that my seed will continue, with the caveat, in his mind, could have been the caveat being Absalom is technically my seed, and so could this be? One thing that just kind of, from a human perspective, we might have in that situation, but not irrespective of this. But then also God's intervention in 2 Samuel 17, verses 14, where, again, leading Absalom to take the advice of Hushai over Ahithophel. And Ahithophel, from what we know back in earlier 2 Samuel through the readings, is that he was a great strategist, and David leaned on him very often. But David, through God's direction, sent Hushai to go basically counteract the advice and kind of help potentially lead him in error to benefit their success. But then also, so obviously on the grander scale, God's intervention played the main point of this, but also it can't go unnoticed that also the skills of David's men, which is outlined in 2 Samuel 17, verses 8, when Hushai is telling him that, look, we all know that David is a man of war and his men are mighty. That's why we need to make sure that we collect as many people as possible when we go to war, because his individuals are well skilled. So although their swords didn't kill the majority, it was still a contributing factor to the success, but obviously, ultimately was dealt through God's hand. And so during the battle, towards the end of it, Absalom met David's men and fled on a mule. And the mule ran under a great terebinth tree, which caught Absalom's head and left him hanging. And he was eventually discovered by a man who told Joab. And what do you think Joab's response was, assuming you read ahead? If not, what do you think it was? Knowing Joab's kind of character and how he's sought to address a lot of these issues prior to.
Why did you not strike him? Why did you not kill him?
That's exactly right. Joab's response was exactly that. If you saw him hanging, why didn't you kill him? You do this, who this individual was, what he was trying to do, why would you not? He even made it to the point to say, I would have paid you for killing him. But the man's response who brought the word to Joab was, even if you offered to pay me 1,000 shekels, it wouldn't have been worth going against the king's directive. When we heard him also, what we heard him give you, because I'd surely be put to death for it. And also made it a point to say that, look, in the situation, if you were there, Joab, you probably wouldn't also come to my rescue either. You would side with the king and let him deal with me as he felt accordingly. Joab, hearing this, decided to take matters into his own hands. And knowing where Absalom was, he grabbed 3 spears and thrust them through Absalom's heart. Then 10 young men surrounded Absalom and killed him. So in 16, we then pick up that once Absalom is dead, Joab then blows the trumpet and puts an end to the battle. Essentially, the revolt had been squashed at that point. But rather than retrieve Absalom's body to provide a proper burial, his body was then cast into a pit and covered with stones. And now, Ahimaaz, where do we know him from? Anyone? Where do we know Ahimaaz from? He is the same individual, along with Jonathan, that was set to kind of be the go-between between the priests and David to relay messages back and forth. When him and Jonathan were the ones that brought the word back to David that said, Ahithophel has sought counsel with Absalom, has directed his people to come after you. You need to now go and cross over the Jordan. So we see that Ahimaaz's role previously had been to relay messages back to David, and so he's seeking to do the same thing here. And he wanted to take the news of the victory back to David. But Joab's initial response was no. Why do we think that was his response to Ahimaaz's request, who had most likely been serving in the same position through the entirety up until this point? I mean, what did David tell them not to do? David told them, deal gently with Absalom. Make sure, essentially saying, please make sure that he doesn't die. And it's not mentioned in the Bible, but one would assume if you're not going to kill him, you're going to bring him back to David, or exile him again, whatever the case may be, but to leave him alive. However, Joab himself was the individual that killed Absalom, and I don't necessarily think that Joab wanted the individual Ahimaaz, who had been also close to David, to then relay the message that his son is dead. He likely knew, because of his relationship with David, how the news was going to be received by him. So because after telling Ahimaaz originally no, because the king's son was dead and that he had no news to give him that was ready, he then turns to the Cushite man that was there and tells him to run and tell David what he saw, which is also kind of an interesting perspective that I kind of looked through and tried to dig around to see if there's a reason why he might have chose the Cushite over Ahimaaz to deliver the message. There's nothing in scriptures that point to anything there, and it would only be purely speculation, but the thought would be, at least from my point of view, was that Ahimaaz was someone, he was an Israelite and knew the direction of the king and was under that authority, but then also was just a close friend of David and his family, and didn't necessarily want Ahimaaz to be the one delivering the message that they had gone against the king's order. And the Cushite, who was not an Israelite, would be someone that maybe Joab felt was more likely kind of willing to take the fall for it based on the king's actions if something were to take place. Again, don't know that, but I think you can kind of read through that towards the end of this chapter where, so once the Cushite received that directive from Joab to go tell him what he saw, he then continues to run off. So then after this point, Ahimaaz then comes back to Joab again and asks him, let me go run after the Cushite to deliver the news. And first Joab again says, you have no news to deliver. Why do you want to go do this? Essentially kind of flagging the issue again with Ahimaaz, saying that this may not necessarily end well for you and for us because we've gone against the king's order and Absalom's death. But Ahimaaz's response essentially is saying is that he's willing to accept whatever may come and that he would like to continue to go deliver the message. Got ahead of myself just a little bit. Okay. Kind of also a physical aspect of this thing, which we'll see here shortly, could have been the reason why Joab was trying to delay Ahimaaz, but we'll notice in verse 27, and we'll touch on that briefly. But again, in verse 21, the Cushite then runs, and Ahimaaz again asks to seek to follow him. Eventually, Joab then allows him to go after Ahimaaz is willing to accept, in his words, but whatever happens, or come what may, let me go deliver the message. So Joab did, and so now the Cushite and Ahimaaz take two different paths. Ahimaaz took the longer path around versus the direction of the Cushite, and as they are both approaching the Menahem, I don't know if I'm saying that place correctly or not, feel free to correct me, back to where David was and where the army first left, the watchman first spots one individual running back to the fortified city. And David's response was, if there's one person coming, they must have good news. Obviously kind of picturing things that if your army was defeated in battle and they were retreating, you would likely see more than one person running back seeking shelter. But in this case, you only see one. And so David, kind of with that thought in his mind, then makes his way down to the city gates to receive this individual. As he is approaching, he then sees a second, which kind of confuses David a little bit to see, in his mind, has something since changed that when the first person left and now the second person, that they're delivering two different messages. He doesn't respond to the sight of the second runner as the same as the first seeking good news. However, evidently Ahimaaz had a very distinct running style, and the watchman noticed that it was someone running like Ahimaaz. And so that kind of gave David kind of reinforcement that because knowing the information that Ahimaaz had brought to him before, he assumes that the good news that Ahimaaz has will be beneficial and is the things that he's seeking to, or that he's expecting to see, are from good news itself. So when Ahimaaz reaches David, he then tells him in verse 28 and 29, in verse 28 reads, so Ahimaaz called out and said to the king, all is well. Then he bowed down with his face to the earth before the king and said, blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against you, my lord the king. The king said, is young man Absalom safe? You can kind of picture what's going through Ahimaaz's mind at this point, because he knows what happened to Absalom, and he also knows the kind of tension that he and Joab had before he left about what type of result may come of this. And so what was Ahimaaz's response after he had been, at least from what we can read, truthful up until this point in all the other messages he had delivered? Ahimaaz's response was, when Joab sent the king's servant and me your servant, I saw a great tumult, but I did not know what it was about. Kind of a save yourself type of ordeal in that situation. And again, it almost leads into the same perspective of reason why Joab sent the Cushite to deliver the true bad news. So when the Cushite finally reaches there, so after Ahimaaz's response, which is lackluster, and says, I don't know, there was a big fight, and that's all that I know. Then David says, stand aside and stand here. And so they waited for the Cushite to reach them and deliver the message, which is in verse 31. Just then the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, there is good news, my lord the king. For the Lord has avenged you this day, all of those who rose against you. Similar in nature to what Ahimaaz first delivered. And now the second part. And the king said to Cushite, is the young man Absalom safe? So the Cushite answered, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise against you to do harm be like that young man. Now, I don't know if the Cushite, my assumption is the Cushite did not know the relation specifically to David, or maybe he clearly doesn't know David as well to recognize how David might receive that information because of how he delivered it. You would think that if you knew that David was not going to necessarily receive that message very well, that you would have tried to make it a little softer as opposed to kind of a victory call saying, I wish everyone that rises against you meets the same fate as this individual. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
And so he went and begged still to go, and then begged to go, and then he went there, and he said, well, I just saw a big happening, I don't really know what happened.
That's right.
So basically, he just corroborated what Joab told him when he was begging to go. I don't know why he did that.
Well, he did say in 28 that God had delivered the men who raised their hands against you, my Lord. So he did say that essentially we had won largely the battle, but specific to what happened to Absalom, I can't speak to that. There was still fighting going on. I don't know. Yes. Mm-hmm.
And he's knowing that you're not going to get a reward if you go and tell him that his son is dead. So there's no benefit for you, is what he's basically telling him there in 22. But he did tell him earlier in 20 that the king's son is dead. So he definitely knew that Absalom had been killed.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So when he got there, he told the story up until a point
Mm-hmm.
where if there was going to be something that could be given him a reward, then he's bringing good news. And so he only wanted to give the good news.
Mm-hmm.
But in my estimation, is that Joab wanted the king to know exactly what had happened.
Mm-hmm.
They won, his son was dead, and his thought of it could be a negative reaction about that. So you could get somebody who's not part of the tribe
Right.
of Israel, but they're, he could have been, they hired mercenaries and conscripts to bolster their armies and stuff back then. And so I'll send this gentleman
Mm-hmm.
to go do it. And so that gentleman he's carrying the message of the king's command.
Mm-hmm.
So he's going to carry it and provide it. And so we went to battle against them. We won. We took out the leader. Hey, that's a good day. And so that's the message that he relays to David.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Any other questions or comments on this front? Okay. That will lead us into chapter 19, or kind of the tail end. And so we then see right at the end of 18, David's response to this news from the Cushite. Just read there briefly. Then the king was deeply moved, went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said thus, O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place. O Absalom, my son, my son. Now you can only kind of think what's running through Absalom and the Cushites' mind at this point. They thought they were bringing great news to the king, and then this is his reaction. And so in verses 19, again, when David received this news of Absalom's death, he mourned the loss, and the words of David's grief made it all the way back to his men, with Joab being told directly. News of the king's grief caused the victory of his men and changed the kind of celebratory mood that these individuals likely would have had to one of grief and mourning, to the point that rather than receiving a warm and victorious welcome when they returned back, they essentially tried to remain unseen when they returned because of how the king received the news that they had slain his son. So when Joab returned along with the remaining army, he went directly to David and said that he had disgraced all of his servants and warriors who had saved his and his family's lives by defeating Absalom, and by David's actions gave the impression that he had loved his enemies and hated his friends. Also, that if Absalom had lived and his servants died, it would have pleased him more. So you can kind of see again Joab kind of rebuking David's reactions and saying, look, you have to realize, so let's back up for a second. They just finished essentially pretty close to a civil war, so there's still a large group of people, not necessarily in David's camp directly, but still aren't necessarily thrilled with David being king, and we're still siding with Absalom at this point. And Joab is saying, essentially, look, hey, the impression that you're giving to the people who are willing to go fight for you is that their lives didn't necessarily mean as much as your son who just revolted against you. These people put their lives on the line to make sure that your throne and your kingdom are safe, and this is how they're being received by their king. You need to think this through, and you need to go out and make this right, to speak to the returning troops and to comfort them, because he risked losing their support based on his current reaction to the victory. Again, counseling him, hey, there's still a lot of work to do, and you could be in danger of losing the only people that are loyal to you based on your response. And so David understood that counseling and then went to the gate based on the direction of Joab. And so in verse 19 and through 14, we see that now although David's men had defeated Absalom, the kingdom did not neatly mesh back together. The divisions between the tribes of Israel made it so that effort was needed by David to rejoin the people. We can see that in verse 9 through 10. In verse 19, and I'll just read that very quickly just to set us there. Again, just identified. Now, in verse 9 it reads, Now all the people were in dispute throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, The king saved us from the hand of our enemies. He has delivered us from the hand of the Philistines, and now he has fled from the land because of Absalom. Essentially saying, look, he had done all this stuff, but then he left. He was banished to exile by his son. But Absalom, who was anointed over us, has now died in battle. Now therefore, why do you say nothing about bringing back the king? So there's a question amongst the people here of kind of what do we do now? The king that we thought we had that was over this, that had done all these great things, was forced out by his own son, and now his son is dead. What's the next course of action? Where do we need to side with? And it's noted there in the following verses that the division was so great that even Judah had not asked him to return. And now, why is that noteworthy? Where was David from? David was from the tribe of Judah. And so the fact that his own tribe did not welcome him back very warmly or seek to bring him back as soon as the battle was over was just a sign of kind of how tumultuous the situation had been. So David then sends his priests, Zadok and Abiathar, to speak to the elders of Judah. To kind of say, we'll just go through here, that David could have, now he could have, instead of sending the priests there, he could have taken the remaining army down into Judah and to stake his claim, rightfully as king over again the combined kingdom of Israel. But he didn't. He chose diplomacy and sought to receive a welcoming instead. And as part of David's character as king, he chooses throughout this process that we can kind of see throughout 2 Samuel, he tends to lean on the side of strategy and persuasion before conflict. And in an effort to win over the favor with the elders of Judah, David asks Amasa to be the commander of his army. Now, who, up until this point, was one of his main commanders of David's army? Joab, right? The same man who just led a third of his army to go defeat Absalom. He's now seeking to put Amasa in this position. And what position did Amasa hold prior to this? He was the commander of Absalom's army. And also, was there a pre-existing relationship between Amasa to David? Exactly. He was his nephew. And so we see that through, we'll pose this as a question again and see if we get anyone to bite here. So why would David offer to place Amasa as his commander over his army, knowing that Joab was still around? Yes, he still has this familiar connection, but Amasa had also just helped lead an army against his throne itself. Why would now be David seeking to put Amasa as commander over his army? That's exactly right. Trying to unify the country. Trying to say, yes, we'll put everything that's happened up until this point now in the past, and let's unify the country. I trust these individuals so much that I'm willing to put even the commander of the old army as the commander of mine to try to bring everyone back together. And this is in verse 14 is where it's there. And so David swayed the hearts of all the men of Judah through these efforts, and Judah sent word saying, David and his servant should return. So again, we kind of see the strategy and diplomacy through David's efforts of trying to create unification by bringing in those previously against him into positions of leadership under him. In verse 15 and 23, we have to pick it up here. As David made his way to Judah, he was met at the Jordan by Shimei, however you want to say that one today, who was from Bahurim. Now, where do we know Shimei from? There's going to be a lot of these questions coming up, so just FYI on these last back half of 19. That's right. So if you go back to 2 Samuel 16, verse 5 through 8, he was the man that was throwing rocks and cursing David as he escaped Jerusalem. So you can kind of think of what might be going through his head, that he's now heard that David's now king again over all of Israel, and it's no coincidence that he's come back down to meet him right as he's crossing the Jordan. So Shimei, but with Shimei, he didn't come by himself. He brought 1,000 men of Benjamin. Again, kind of showing their buy-in from that tribe itself. And as soon as David crossed the Jordan, Shimei fell before David, begging for mercy and asking for his past actions to not be held against him. But just like back in 16:9 in 2 Samuel, we see Abishai again is ready to kill Shimei again for his actions towards David then. And if you'll recall back in 16, Abishai was ready to strike Shimei down then for cursing at the king and said we should kill him like the dog that he is. But David, again, in his response, insisted to spare his life. Now, it's important to know, because we've got the Bible, we're able to, again, kind of see what happens and transpires after this. So David does spare his life now, but in 1 Kings 2, verses 8 through 9, he directs Solomon to have him killed. Verses 24 through 30, we see that Mephibosheth also came to meet David. Where do we know him from? Or what do we know about him? He's the son of Jonathan, the grandson of Saul. Yes. Yes. In chapter 19, David showed him kindness, giving him Saul's land and a seat at his table. This is the grandson of Saul who couldn't walk. But if we also refer back, during the revolt of Absalom, who do we also know that is associated with Mephibosheth? I know y'all didn't come ready for this quiz that I was going to give you today. Ziba, yes, that's exactly right. And Ziba was the servant charged with taking care of Mephibosheth and over the land that he had given to him through David's direction. But, let's see here. Let's see if I've got this site here. So if we go back, I think it's in 16. In 16, we see where Ziba comes back and meets David as he's fleeing from Jerusalem. Actually, maybe getting ahead of myself. Yes, so we'll just go through from where we are. So Ziba is the servant that brought and met David in the mountains, bringing him food and donkeys with news that Mephibosheth had sided with Absalom. So first, we see that David had shown favor to Saul's grandson Mephibosheth when he was still over the full kingdom and placed Ziba in charge. And as the revolt took place, he left Mephibosheth, went to meet David, brought him goods and transportation. And when David asked him, where's the person you're supposed to be serving? Essentially, where is Mephibosheth? Ziba says that he sided with Absalom. And so because of that, David then says, everything that I had given to Mephibosheth is now yours. So that brings us to Mephibosheth in verse 24. And David's probably considering the fact of the favor that he had showed him in the past, and then asked, had he not, or getting ahead of myself. We'll just keep going through. So, and Mephibosheth's response when he came to meet with David was, what took place? Where were you when Ziba came and met me? And Mephibosheth's response was, Ziba deceived me and rode off knowing that I could not follow him because I was lame. Essentially, what Mephibosheth is relaying is that when Ziba left, I intended to go with him. I sent him to go saddle up a ride for me to bring me to you. And at that point in time, Ziba left knowing that I couldn't follow him because I'm lame and unable to saddle my own mule to come meet you. And the message that you received was not accurate. But rather than kind of continue to plead his case, he told David to do whatever he saw was good in his eyes. And David, knowing he had already granted the land to Ziba and finding the situation difficult, decided to split the land evenly rather than determine who was telling the truth, which is kind of a character flaw, if you want to call it for one, that we see in David, is that he's usually unwilling to make the hard decisions to kind of find the truth or to make the right decision call. Nothing transpires from this specifically, but again, it's kind of a point to sack that if you would have addressed the situation with Amnon and Tamar, we may not have necessarily had the situation with Absalom killing his brother and then seeking to overthrow the king. But David chose not to make the hard decision at that point, and those things transpired. Same thing with Bathsheba. David chose to make the wrong decision at that point and call that set all of this into motion. And again, we see this one as just another instance to where you have the ability to discern. He could have questioned both of them and got down to the root cause of it and addressed the sin potentially of one of them, but rather than that, he just said, you know what, we'll just split it, we'll call it even, and both of you go about your day. But in verse 31 and 39, we then see that the last individual that comes up here in this chapter, Barzillai, the Gileadite, came down from Roglion to meet David at the Jordan. And now this one should be a little easier. Where do we know him from? And I say that because we touched on it earlier. So only if you were paying attention. This is in 17:27 through 29, where David was running from Absalom and went to Menahem. It was Shobi, Machir, and Barzillai who brought David and his men food. So David, remembering the favor that was shown to him, then asked for Barzillai to cross over the Jordan with him and to allow David to provide for him during his stay as he had done when he was there. However, the offer was declined by Barzillai, stating that his age would prevent him from enjoying all the things that David would have offered him in verse 35. However, he insisted and asked David to take his servant Chimham instead, so that he may die in his own city, and leaving David to do what he saw good with his servant. And so David was also instructed Solomon, so we kind of, again, fast forward again. He then, in telling Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 7, to show kindness to the sons of Barzillai because of what he had done for him back then. So you, again, in this process, as we continue to see David address the kind of initial things as he's forming to bring the kingdom of Israel back under one kingship, he is, again, acknowledging the issues here, but then also as he's dying and giving his direction to Solomon, making note of the things that he's come across that Solomon should need to address and to keep those in mind for. And that will lead us to the end of this section today. Brother Glenn Asher will pick up here and cover us through, I believe the middle of chapter 20 next week. If I remember correctly, I think it's to the tail end of there, so feel free to read then. Are there any questions and comments? I know we're a little bit ahead of schedule very briefly, so happy to take comments, thoughts, questions. I think it's just interesting to note from this perspective that, again, that we see David is a man of God after God's own heart, but there are things that he kind of continues to fall short in some areas and kind of take into account the broader picture and how things will be received. And his kind of lack of ability to push by the kind of things that are initially in his face to kind of see what his decisions and thoughts might impact those around him, which is kind of the tunnel vision that we tend to have in some areas in issues. And so up until this point, we haven't necessarily seen David try to confront those shortcomings rather than he kind of continues to push through and kind of keeps those things hindrances to himself, which kind of, again, prevents a fault that he has to continue to overcome throughout this process. So if there's no other comments or questions, I appreciate y'all's attention, and we will pick back up this next week. Thank y'all.